and we're recording. Otto, what's up, dude?
Oh, nothing much, Peter. How are you doing?
Dude, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I'm excited about this episode. This is gonna be a good one. Talk about major factions and tactics and weapons and fun stuff that people like to talk about. Oh, we gotta play the intro. Play the
Yeah,
intro.
that's right. Play
All
the
right, let's
intro.
do it.
Roll it.
Bar Association vigorously describes how his administration is fighting communism abroad and at home. And then he says,
That
Well,
goes hard.
it does, and I hope if you were a viewer that you were really paying attention to that, because part of the video, the intro, shows something I'm going to be talking about personally in the video. So I hope you were actually paying attention, not just geeking out to the music.
Yeah, or if you're listening to it on the soon-to-be uploaded Substack or Spotify, then you should just go watch it on YouTube, even just to watch the intro, because I put some hard effort into that. Maybe have some copyright violations in there, but we'll deal with that, when it comes. So,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. I definitely just clipped that from like random places on the internet and cobbled it together. But today we're talking about the major factions in the Rhodesian Bush War on both sides. I'm covering the red communist, black nationalist guerrilla side. Otto, you are covering the Rhodesian government side.
Yes, the Rhodesian security forces.
Yeah.
Is generally what they go by. I mean, you can call them the Rhodesian Army, but like the Rhodesian Army is like a part of that. It's like if we said like the United States military, we have the Marines, we have the Navy, the Coast Guard, the Air Force. Well, the
Right.
Rhodesian military is called the Rhodesian Security Forces.
Yep. Yeah. And it's a good thing you pointed that. I was actually going to point that out when we get to the guerrilla forces, because have you ever seen the movie Life of Brian?
Um,
It's a Monty
I
Python movie.
I've seen like like the name, like the Roman dude in it, and I've
Yeah,
seen
yeah, you've
some
seen
of the
clips of it.
yeah, I've
There,
seen
there's
clips of it.
there's a clip in there where they're all sitting at like an amphitheater, and they're joking about like basically like how communist revolutionaries, especially like in the later half of the 20th century, there's like in any given revolutionary war there's like 15 different groups all fighting each other ostensibly on the same side, and in the clip they're like, no, those guys, that's the People's Front of Judea, and no, that's the Liberation Judean Army, and no, that guy is from the Front for the People of Judea. And that clip cracks me up every time I think about the Rhodesian Bush War, because that's exactly how it is in the
Oh
communist
yeah,
side. But do you want to go ahead and talk about the Rhodesian side, because I think that'll be simpler in terms of the
yes,
factions, the major people, the politics. You could start with that first, and then I can delve into the more complicated side of the guerrillas after that, maybe.
yes. Now I'd like to forewarn and apologize that for my notes I didn't focus on much as leaders and things like that. And what I did do for that is going to be mostly kind of good old boying it. So obviously, to start with, the leader of Rhodesia when it declared its independence from the British Empire is Prime Minister Ian Smith. As stated in the last video, Smith is a World War II veteran. He was a fighter pilot. I believe he served in. I want to say it was in Italy. He also served in North Africa, I believe, and I think he might have got shot down over the Alps in the war, or either
So
flown missions over the Alps.
was he serving with the British, or was he serving as part of the Rhodesian contingent sent to fight with the British?
I believe he was serving. I could be wrong, but I know he's an officer. I wish I had, when I was doing the research last time, I wish I'd paid more close attention to it.
Don't
I
worry,
believe
I'll pull it up on Wikipedia right now.
I
Here we go.
believe he was with the British military as an
Let's see.
officer.
Let's see what it says here. We're professionals, dude. We are doing this the most professionally possible. So it says he was with number 237 parentheses Rhodesia Squadron of the Royal Air Force. So I guess it's
Okay,
like,
so he
so
was
part of the Royal Air Force, but one of the colonial like units,
regiments.
basically.
Yes, it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like
yeah.
it's kind of like in the melee emergency, you have like the Far Eastern Volunteers, which basically are the people that became the Rhodesian SAS in the
Right,
Rhodesian
right.
Bush War.
Yeah, very common theme with the British Empire generally, but yeah.
Now, like, guess getting more into the military side of things, the actual head honcho of the military, the Rhodesian Security Forces, I say head honcho, the second in command, theoretically, of the Rhodesian Security Forces is a guy named Peter Walls. In my notes, I had him as Peter Wells, and I just realized that that was, wrong a few minutes ago, and it really made me angry. But I have a little more information on Mr. Walls. So, unlike uh, Prime Minister Smith, Walls actually joined the British military. He actually served in the Black Watch. Now, if you don't know what the Black Watch is, the Black Watch is the 42nd Highland Regiment. So these are Scotsmen. These are, think of bearskin caps, kilts. They weren't that in World War II, but I mean, the Black Watch is a major history. They fought at Waterloo. I believe that they fought at the Battle of Balaclava and the Crimean were very renowned unit.
Oh
Um,
yeah, oh yeah.
very, very well known. Um, he fought with them in World War II, and he comes from a military family. If you have the picture up of him, you can go to the picture
Yeah,
of
let
it
me
to
let me get
show
that.
him. He kind of has almost like that's him. This
Oh
almost
yeah.
sort of like
Look at little handsome guy. Look at
Benito
him.
Mussolini kind of look to me, but I also see a little bit of Mel Gibson in him, kind of.
Oh yeah.
Not what you typically the pictures and things I've been seeing of the officers at the time for the Rhodesian military kind of have this almost like Zulu Wars looking like facial hair and this sort of like what we think of as like almost like if you played Call of Duty, like Captain Price kind of look. But this guy looks like a modern, to me, like a modern, like like drill. Like I could see this guy being like a Marine drill sergeant.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah.
He just looks like a bad one. Um, not gonna use what I would say privately on here.
Yeah.
You can
Look,
at and two S's. So anyway, he's gonna head the Rhodesian forces. What were you gonna say, Peter?
I was gonna say never mind. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay, so Peter Walls, I'm gonna get that mixed up. He is gonna serve from, I believe it's basically the start of the war to the very end of the war. He's going to go into exile in South Africa because he was not liked by the Mugabe government at all. So that pretty much covers my list of the of like the generals and leaders of the military. I mainly want to touch on the logistics of the Rhodesian military. So as we've been going on, in the past about, oh, they're supplied by these countries, supplied whatever, back and forth, yada yada yada. Um, the RDS logistics is mainly going to come from self-made materials or smuggled supplies, mainly coming in the form of South Africa, Portugal, and Israel.
Right.
Now, most of
Right.
these logistics are going to be things like guns. For example, the G3 battle rifle, service rifle, is going to be coming from Portugal because at this time, Portugal's fighting a war over in Mozambique, and Rhodesia is going to be helping them in that war, sending groups like Sella Scouts and SAS and cross-border raids. Those groups are going to, pick that gun up and they're going to use it. Israel is going to supply things like the Uzi to Rhodesia. The Uzi was very much loved by Rhodesian soldiers and the civilians. Here's the thing we got to keep in mind too about this war, is the way this war is being fought is, as we talked in the last episodes, a lot of it is attacks on rural farmsteads and out in the bush. So it's not a lot of urban warfare or like these grand assaults. So what we're seeing is close quarters. We're seeing a need for civilians to basically be armed at all times. So if you hear any kind of weapon, small arms referenced in this, you can imagine as well that that's going to be in the hands of a Rhodesian civilian.
Yeah, I read in my book, which is the Rhodesian War, a military history, part of the Stackpole military history series. I read a figure in there that said there was at the outbreak of the war 120,000 privately registered arms in the hands of white civilians. So many more guns than there were white civilians in Rhodesia at the time. But yeah,
Yes.
yeah, interesting.
Those those guns are going to come in a variety of forms because they're going to be some of them are going to be top of the grade, FALs, G3s, Uzis, but then you're going to have things like Browning Auto 5s, which if you're a shotgun user, you know that if I'm correct on this, that was the first mass-produced semi-auto shotgun.
Yeah, I don't know if it was the first, but it was certainly one of the
I
first.
mean,
It's been
you
around for
can
a very long
you
time.
can go to like pretty much any gun auction or even a lot of gun stores, and they still sell them.
Hmm.
I know the ones they're using in Rhodesia. I know it wasn't Garantham, but it was somebody else similar to him. Posted a video back a few months ago with one, and a lot of them they would shorten down the barrel for that that close quarter combat.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to see things like Stens, Lanchesters. Um, they're actually going to take those Uzis and they're going to chop them down and homemade make them in Rhodesia and call them Ruzis.
That's funny.
A lot of the Ruzis are actually going to be semi-auto, and they're going to shoot 9mm because the Uzis are expensive imports. And those guns will actually make their way into South Africa and be used in the South Africa border war, which is going on at the same time as this war, and we'll go
Right.
past it. Let's
So
see. Oh, go ahead.
before
Go ahead.
before you go any further, can you break down like the different units in the Rhodesian military? Because I'm familiar personally with the Selous Scouts. I've read some books on them, but I know you were talking about they have the SAS, the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the Rhodesian African Rifles. I know is a famous Black African unit from Rhodesia that fought in I think World War II and Malaya to an
Yes.
extent, maybe, but
Yes.
especially they were involved in the Rhodesian Bush War. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So, as I was saying, the Rhodesian security forces, are made up by, they're made up by an army. They're made up by not a navy. They're made up by an army. They're made up by a motor corps. They're made up by an air force. Within the army, the main units people have heard of are the, RLI, Rhodesian Light Infantry. You're going to have the Cella Scouts. You're going to have the SAS. SAS is going to be any at this point any Commonwealth country besides Canada is going to have an SAS regiment or group, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, Britain. They're going to have them. That's kind of like a Anglo world catch-all term for like special air service, special forces. I guess to go into more dynamics of those groups. So the RLI is almost like the opposite of the Rhodesian African Rifles. So just to kind of give a base stat, I guess you would say, or base, idea. The majority of the Rhodesian military is black. It's not white, but the
A
RLI
lot of
is
people don't know that. A lot of people
yes.
don't know that.
The RLI, which if you can move the pictures one by one, I'll get you a
Hmm.
picture of an RLI soldier.
Let's see here.
Not that one, not that one.
These are
That
not in
one,
any
that
particular
one, that
order.
one.
So here we go.
Yeah,
Yeah, there we go.
that's one. This is
Quintessential
this is an
roadie
RLI on like
outfit.
combat in the bush fighting. So the RLI are going to be an all volunteer regiment and an all white regiment. They are pretty much what we think of when we think of Rhodesian combat troops. They are pretty much the group that's going to select the most action of the war. They're light. A lot of them are going to take the slings and the carry handles off their FAL, which this gentleman here did not take his sling off, which is fine. That's actually quite common. I know it's a minor detail, but that
Yeah, I've heard from Vietnam veterans. I mean, me personally, I was in a light infantry unit in the military. I always carried a sling. I when especially on long patrols, I think slings are necessary. But I've heard American Vietnam veterans talk about slings being a hazard in the jungle. And
yes,
I mean, a lot of people think about Africa. They think about the terrain as being, um, I guess like kind of these open plains, and to a large extent they were, but Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now is especially heavily wooded, and even in the plains areas, I mean, you're talking large grass very very tall grass, dense brush. So taking your sling off makes a lot of sense for some people. Shooter's preference,
Yes,
but
yes, and a lot of the content I was watching in preparation for this talked about that a lot of the vets claimed that it made a sound that you could hear it being moved around.
yeah,
It would kind of give away your position because you got to think most of these gunfights are happening in less 100 to less than 100 yards.
yeah,
So all being bush too, sometimes we might not realize this, but from my understanding of a lot of combat is that you've got rounds to spend, and if you think somebody's somewhere, a lot of times you can just fire there and kind of
yeah,
just sort of,
absolutely.
basically, spit rounds down range to keep them down or to, hopefully hit them.
Yeah, and yeah, I don't want to get too far. I don't want to jump too far ahead into the tactics, but yeah, that's very common. That's a very common feature of combat in terrain like this. I mean, some people would call it reconnaissance by fire.
Yes.
So you shoot at somebody if you think they're there, and if they shoot back, then they're there. But
Yes.
yeah, interesting. Anyway,
Yes. So basically, this is like I would say that the RLI are basically equipped like the regular soldiers of the Rhodesian military, but they're assigned more pressing tasks, which we'll get to in a bit. I wanted to when we go over to the Fire Force discussion, I will go over their main equipment and things like that. But
yeah. Well, and I,
with
I also want to. I think it's important to point out here too. I've seen figures, and I don't remember if it was from this military history book or if I've seen it online. But the Rhodesian military was, I think, at the height of the war, they had something like 10,000 service members in their standing military, but they had another 40,000 on a kind of rotating reserve basis. There's actually a guy on
yes,
YouTube, 5 Romeo, which was his call sign. He's a Rhodesian War veteran, and he was not part of any. I guess what we would call in America like active duty. He was in like a territorial force or some kind of part-time reservist force, and
yeah.
they would do stints from like 4.5 months to 6 months. I think that the length of their deployments got longer and longer as the war progressed. But that was a huge part of the Rhodesian forces, that you had civilians who would go to their day job, and then half the year they would spend out in the bush, and then they'd come back, which took a big toll on the
Oh
economy of the
yes,
Rhodesian
yes.
economy as well.
I wanted to kind of speak. I originally didn't want to speak on that because I had some information I'd heard about that, but I couldn't find the source. But I've heard stuff that some troops would go on like 2 week durations. You would go on a deployment for 2 weeks and then go back to the civilian world for 2 weeks. So 2 weeks you're working an office job as I don't know, a lawyer, and the next 2 weeks you're out in the bush. So you better hope you don't get killed, or your clients might be out of luck.
Yeah, and
Um,
some other units I just want to touch on as well, which because I think they're cool. I know we talked about Rhodesian Light Infantry, the SAS. Another one I think is interesting is the Greys Scouts, where they were Rhodesian mounted infantry unit.
yes,
And it says here, according to Wikipedia, okay, so take that for what you will, that they were raised in 1975, but they were mounted like on horses.
yes.
I think is really cool. Cool
I
fact.
was originally planning to touch on them, but due for the sake of time, I and also too, horse units in modern war since the Second World War have played a second fiddle to other
Oh,
groups.
absolutely,
I
absolutely.
mean, they're a good image for them, and that the short shorts, the FAL, and the bush stroke is what people think of in the war. But like when I actually examine main Rhodesian bush war stuff, whether it's images, whatever, they don't really pop up a lot anymore.
Yeah, I
So I
think they
kind
only
of sort
had
of
like a
play away from
thousand.
them.
I think they only had like 1,000
Yeah,
at their peak, and
yeah,
again that was late war. By 1975, that's already pretty deep into the war. So yeah,
yes,
just a note. We can carry
yes.
on.
And and also too for like tactical doctrine of these mounted forces. No, they're not charging into they're not charging into gunfire, full gallop, shooting from the horseback. That hasn't happened in a long time. I mean, heck, even in the Civil War in the West, uh, a lot of the cavalry or mounted infantry units, because the Gray Scouts would be considered mounted infantry, not cavalry. A lot of times when they would go into combat, they would just ride to the battlefield, and the majority of the men would dismount, and
Right.
they would have designated troopers meant to hold the reins of the horses. And some of
Right.
the
Right.
footage I've seen of Gray Scouts, it seems like what they did is they would either scout around riding on horseback, or if they got engaged, they would dismount and engage on foot. But
Yeah,
anyway,
and
oh,
it
go ahead.
does make sense. Sorry, just one more thing. It does make sense to an extent. I mean, historically, I think in 16th, 17th and 18th century warfare, we would refer to them as dragoons. People who
Yes.
use the horses to get to and from combat. And in Rhodesia, someplace where, again, this is the Bush War, most of the roads that existed were not paved. So huge swaths of this massive country were, inaccessible except by foot. So having horses to get to and fro does actually make quite a bit of sense. But I don't think they were used because tactically they were not.
Yeah.
We're not a major player in the war, but
No, not a major player, just for aesthetics.
it looks sick.
Now, to go on about, I guess like when we go up to another level, so we think of, I guess you want to say this, like ROI is like our Army Rangers, and the SAS is like our Navy SEALs. So the Rhodesian SAS, they, are not, they're not, they, I don't believe they were segregated, but they pretty much, you had to meet, insane physical requirements. There's actually, I think I sent you a picture of some SAS soldiers kind of
Let's
start
see here.
scrolling. They have, that's them. That's them.
That's them. Oh yeah.
Yes. So Rhodesian SAS troops are going to paradrop. They're also going to operate on the fire force tactic level. A lot of pictures I've seen them, they wear helmets. Not to get too much in the weeds of, helmets, but there's going to be basically two main helmets that you're going to see used in the Rhodesian Bush War. And there's basically like a South African made helmet, and then there is a British paratrooper helmet from World War II, and and then extend that over to, basically whatever the modern of that time British helmet was that was not the Brody helmet.
Yeah.
That is what if you wore a helmet in Rhodesia, that's what you used.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time you're not going to see guys wearing helmets. You
No,
look at a lot of the
you're not,
pictures.
because
I think part of the reason why you might be more likely to see SAS guys wearing helmets, just from the anecdotes I've seen, is that a lot of times these guys were being deployed for hard hitting border raids, things where they might expect to receive
yes,
heavy fire. And remember, also they're not wearing body armor, so a helmet is really only good not against rifle rounds, but it's especially effective for shrapnel. So you and we'll get into this a little bit later on, I'm sure, when we talk about tactics. But if they're doing a cross border raid against a guerrilla base where they expect to take mortar fire, it might make sense to wear a helmet.
yes.
But most of the time, you're not going to see them wearing helmets on patrol, especially.
I was reading a little bit about that today, and like an example of that would be I guess an example of this would be these guys would be going, fighting not the, ZANU or ZAPU. They might be fighting, like the Zambian or the Mozambican, enemy militaries.
Right.
And those groups had, actual tanks. So these
Right.
guys are going to be more what we think of almost is, even though they're special forces, they're going to look more like conventional soldiers. They're not going to be wearing, short shorts. And, these guys are, suited up.
They're rolling heavy, dude. They're
rolling heavy. They're they set a presence and a tone.
Yeah. On that, do you want me to segue into talking about the guerrillas? Because we're talking about Mozambique and Zambia, and I think a lot of people probably don't know the broader situation.
If you can do that, but I want to come back to the Cella Scouts.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to talk about their structure for a little bit? I'm trying to keep this organized for the for the casual listener.
So the Cella Scouts are they're essentially Rhodesia's equivalent of MACV SOG. They don't segregate. They actually take some of the prisoners of war and recruit them.
Yes, a lot
Um,
of former guerrillas
yes.
were in this unit.
Cellus Scouts is going to do everything from biochemical warfare to spying to sabotage. Um, I'm not going to use that word.
War crimes.
Yeah. There might be some things of that. Basically, if you wanted the baddest of the bad in the Rhodesian security forces, this was them. They, a lot of times, as with all the groups, cross border activity is quite common. Um, so think of these guys literally as like Mac v Sog, but for Rhodesia.
Yeah,
As we can
yeah.
tell in this picture, they're not wearing, as far as I can tell, one of them might have bush stroke on, but we see solid greens and we got some khaki drill. Um,
And
basically, if and during these cross border raids, a lot of these groups would dress in a way. Basically, they would not wear anything that made them look like Rhodesian soldiers. As far as we know, these could be anybody.
right.
You might just see that they're white or that they're black, but
And
we don't know. You don't
if I
know to
can
look
riff
if
on
they're
that for a
American or
second,
Russian. Yes, go ahead.
if I can riff on that for a second, I got this book here called Bush War Operator by Mr. A.J. Balaam, Balaam, Memoirs of the Rhodesian Light Infantry, Sailor Scouts and Beyond. So he was a Sailor Scout, and most of the book deals with his operations with the Sailor Scouts. And so in this picture in particular, you'll see they're very dark. And you're wondering, what is that? Is it camouflage paint? It's not actually camouflage paint. What it is blackening cream. So the Sailor Scouts, from the figures I've seen, were somewhere between 75 80% black unit, because most of what they did was called pseudo operations, and basically they would go out and pretend to be guerrillas. So you would have a
Yes.
unit, a squad of black African native Sailor Scouts, typically commanded by like a sergeant major who was a white Rhodesian, and they would go out, and the whites would have to dress and look as closely as they could to appear black. That way they would not give away their the fact that they were Rhodesians. And then they would go out and pretend to be guerrillas and try and gain information from locals, infiltrate local guerrilla groups, and then kill or capture guerrilla leaders and civilian sympathizers from there. And then they were also involved with several major joint raids across the border with the SAS and other Rhodesian military units. But that was mostly what they did is the pseudo operations.
Yes. I was going to say, oh yes, I remember what it was. So when the war concludes, these are Cella Scouts, like one of the first units that are just gotten rid of completely. A lot of the white volunteers, a lot of the white members of the Cella Scouts, they will go to South Africa to immediately begin fighting in the border war. But unfortunately, a lot of the black veterans of the Cella Scouts are going to just be assassinated, like quite literally. The government does not want them. They kill most of them, so most of them die. So if you see a black Cella Scout, it's probably a sad reality. You're looking at a picture of a murder victim.
Yeah, almost certainly they were a massive target of the punitive. Mugabe's punitive massacres in the after the end of the war. All right, you got more on Rhodesian factions or what?
Mainly, I kind of had plans to talk about Fire Force.
Well, let me hit the
Unless
structure
you
of
want to
the.
segue to your guerrillas, because we want to get time for that. So you can go ahead and do that, and I could cover
Yeah, well,
Fire
I'm figuring
Force stuff.
We'll bounce back and forth. Let me talk about the factions, and then we can talk about. We'll do each in tandem if that sounds cool.
That sounds good.
All right. So so the guerrillas are a little bit more complicated than the Rhodesians. Like I was mentioning before, the clip from Life of Brian, several guerrilla groups, but there are two primary ones that you need to be concerned with. The first one is ZAPU, which is the Zimbabwe African People's Army, ZAPU. They were the first of the guerrilla groups. They were formed in 1961 after the National Democratic Party was banned, which itself was formed after the Rhodesian African National Congress was banned in 1959. So if you remember from the last episode, the African National Congress was a political party And ZAPU was also a political party, but they were one of the first political parties in Rhodesia to assert Black nationalist political aims on the political stage. They were tangentially related to the South African National Congress, but they were separate. So ZAPU's militant wing was ZIPRA, which was the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, and these were supported by the Matabele. So if you remember from last episode, the Matabele are the tribe in the west. They were the ones that were originally conquered when the whites colonized Rhodesia, and the Shona tribe is predominantly in the east of Rhodesia. They were aligned with the USSR. They were primarily tactically and strategically, they were more urban focused. So they were more interested in garnering the support and rallying urban workers in the cities and urban centers in Rhodesia, and which is contrasted with ZANU, which is their opposition. They trained. Oh, they were led by Joshua Nkomo, Nkomo. The party, not ZIPRA. I'm not really going to talk about the military commanders because it'll get too complicated. But Joshua Nkomo was the head of ZAPU, and he founded it. Let's see here. So ZANU, which I said is kind of their corollary, is the Zimbabwe African National Union. They split from ZAPU in 1963 under Sithol's leadership, and I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce Sithol's first name, so we'll just say Sithol. They believed that ZAPU was kind of approaching the war a little bit too aggressively. They were being too conventional in their tactics. So in 1963, they split, formed ZANU with the militant wing ZANLA, which is the Zimbabwe National African Liberation Army, and they were primarily focused in the east. So if you look at this map where you see the Zambian border, that's going to be the region that ZAPU and their militant wing ZIPRA are operating out of into Zimbabwe. And if you see the Mozambique border, that is where ZANU and ZANLA are operating out of. Again, this is kind of getting into the tribal affiliations of these guerrilla groups, because they were, Matabele and Shona respectively. They were aligned with China. ZANU was aligned with China. So their philosophical and strategic approach to the war was more focused on the rural peasantry. Contrast that with the USSR style of communist revolution. You can understand why the Chinese would push ZANU to operate in that way. So they were more Maoist, whereas the USSR or the ZAPU was kind of operating more on Trotskyite and Stalinist communist tradition, I guess, if you want to say that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, that's you see these things a lot. This happens a lot with guerrilla wars and communist wars during this period. Let's see here. In 1969, the ZANU leaders in exile in Zambia set up the Dare Re Chimurenga, which is basically an 8-man war council that was an attempt to unify ZAPU and ZANU. And there were several other organizations that were brought together to try and kind of unify these two organizations. None of them ever succeeded, and that will, foreshadowing for the end of the war, how that turns out. But in Mozambique, remember, Portugal at this time in the early part of the war controls Mozambique, and they're fighting a revolution there against Frelimo. Frelimo is the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. And eventually, kind of skipping over the details, Frelimo wins in Mozambique in 1974. And after that, ZANU and their militant wing ZANLA are basically given free reign, and they are allied with Frelimo to operate out of Mozambique. So they begin building training bases, very, very large training bases. So you're talking 10,000 recruits, civilians, hangers-on at these bases in Mozambique. And same thing happened in Zambia with ZAPU and ZIPRA, but to a lesser extent. ZANLA was always the bigger guerrilla group, more influential guerrilla group. In 1975, ZANU split into ZANU PF and ZANU Ndonga. So Robert Mugabe kind of comes onto the scene at this point. He had been in the leadership of ZANU, but under Robert Mugabe's leadership, ZANU PF kind of takes the reins. ZANU Ndonga kind of falls by the wayside. And and ZANU, as we would understand it, which is the political party that controlled Zimbabwe for decades after the war, is in the hands of Robert Mugabe at that point. So those are the kind of two major leaders that you got to understand. In the West, with the Matabele and ZAPU, you have Joshua Nkomo, and in the East, with ZANU, you have Robert Mugabe after 1975. As far as organizations, that's kind of it. There's some other ones we can touch on. So very interestingly, you were talking about the border war in South Africa, Otto. The African National Congress was a political party, but they were also supplying militants for the border war in South Africa. And in the early stages of the war, they were actually working with ZAPU in the western part of Rhodesia with the hopes of being able to establish guerrilla training bases in Botswana and Zambia, and then use those to infiltrate back into South Africa. If you see on the map there where it says Johannesburg, it's in northeastern South Africa. That was kind of their strategic target. So that stuff kind of fell by the wayside, and the South African National Congress isn't really a major player later in the war, but in the early days of the war, they were instrumental in supporting ZAPU in the western part of Zimbabwe, or of Rhodesia. So you can kind of see how all of these communist uprisings, right? Keep in mind that the Vietnam War is going on at the exact same time. Cuba happened not that long ago. The world really is at war with communism. Domino theory, something that if you took any American public school social studies class, your communist social studies teacher probably told you was a joke and was a very bad justification, a fake justification for why we got involved in Vietnam. Africa is the test case for why domino theory is not, nonsense. I mean, you have Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, all of these places have major guerrilla groups fighting revolutions, and they're supporting one another. Belgian Congos, right? Yeah, exactly. And Tanzania, Angola, you'll hear these countries come up as well. I mean, you're covering the entire continent of Africa, all the way up to Egypt. And so yeah, I mean, this is almost like a worldwide guerrilla war. You know, it's like World War III, but like not quite. It's like World War 2.1, I would say, something like that.
That's kind of interesting because, like, even like Vietnam is a guerrilla war mostly. I mean, yeah. I mean, I know the NVA was a legitimate army. You know, they legitimate battles like Khe Sanh, Dien Bien Phu, Hue City. But yeah, it's kind of weird to think even like the Russians in Afghanistan, it was a Cold War. I mean not Cold War. It was a guerrilla war. Basically, the only Cold War that was not a guerrilla war was the Korean War.
Yeah, no, and keep in mind, like, the timeline, right? That's early 50s, and then it doesn't take long for every major war going on to transition to adopting proper Maoist, or I guess Leninist, Stalinist doctrines of revolution. And interestingly enough, the guerrillas that were training for the war in Rhodesia, even in the early 60s, before hostilities officially broke out, before UDI, they were training in Ghana, Cuba, Egypt, Algeria, Tanzania, China, Russia, Eastern Bloc states. So guerrillas are getting on planes, going out, training, becoming political commissars, becoming trained cadres, and then coming back and preparing to fight this war. And that training continues for the entire time. In 1969, Chinese advisors actually arrived in Mozambique to train with ZANU and ZANLA. So you actually have Chinese nationals who are training guerrilla fighters on the border with Rhodesia.
I want to posit something to you real quick, and I don't know if you researched into it, but there's a common thing tied around about the war, about how basically the Rhodesian security forces had a insane. I mean, I've heard for every one Rhodesian casualty, there was 100 African, communist casualties. I heard another statistic that said for every one Rhodesian casualty, there was 35 African communist casualties. Have you found any research? Have you found any other numbers on that? And like, do you think you could explain as to why, even though they're being trained by Russians and Chinese,
yeah,
why that's the case?
I can't attest to the veracity of any of those figures, And you see this in Vietnam too, where body counts are often overinflated. But the fact that there is a tactical disparity between the Rhodesians and the guerrillas cannot be overstated. So even though these guys are trained, there's actually a funny anecdote from this book, Bush War Operator, where after the war is over, you were talking about the South African border wars. I believe A.J. Ballum was fighting. He had basically been contracted as a mercenary to train guerrilla groups by the South African government, to try and overthrow the Black nationalist government in like the separatist state of Lesotho.
Mhm.
And he had noted that it was like it took weeks and weeks and weeks to train the African natives, to understand the basic fundamentals of marksmanship. So something that Westerners, especially Americans who've grown up with guns, might take for granted. Africans just culturally did not grasp basic fundamentals of marksmanship. So it's been there. You can find a million anecdotes of this, but the African guerrillas almost, I guess it's kind of tongue in cheek, but they would almost think that winning a gunfight is more about making lots of noise and sending lots of tracers down range than it is about actually getting hits on target. And so, yeah, these guys are ostensibly trained as guerrillas, but in any gunfight, I mean, 10 Rhodesian security force soldiers against 100 guerrillas, it's not even a fair fight. And it's not to say that Rhodesians didn't die, because they obviously did, but the primary tactic of guerrillas, and Mao said this as well, right? Guerrilla tactics depend on the ability of the guerrilla to run away. So guerrillas have no intention of staying and fighting prolonged engagements, because they know they will lose. And I think especially with the African natives, there is not a cultural way of war and a cultural way of handling firearms that would make them particularly effective marksmen. So, and then there's also the technological gap. I mean, the Rhodesians had an air force, and while the guerrilla groups, especially in Zambia and Mozambique, had tanks and anti-air guns and aircraft, the USSR was supplying Angola with MiGs. Those were never actually used in Rhodesia. So all of the guerrillas that were fighting in Rhodesia were fighting on foot and were infiltrating, through trails and through kind of like an underground railroad system, walking by foot for sometimes hundreds of kilometers to get to the areas that they were operating in. So, yeah, it's certainly true.
That's also a testament to, like, for the Rhodesian security forces. I mean, a lot of times, even for their troops in combat, like especially the RLI, their soldiers aren't even wearing uniforms a lot of times. They're just going in with the shirt and shorts and their ammo
Oh yeah.
belt going into fight. So it seems like it's a very like downscaled, literally like men on the ground just with guns shooting each other in what we would think of as more like a firefights, not like battles.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct. And I can actually talk about the size of the guerrilla forces to a certain extent. I pulled some figures out of this book here, and they said that in 1972, there were only some 300 trained Zanla guerrillas operating in Rhodesia. 300 in the entire country. Zebra at the time was somewhat larger, with 400 guerrillas, and that was like in early 1970. As the war progresses, the number of guerrillas increases. So 1975, they had something like 6,000 guerrillas trained and recruits that were in training. But at any given time, they're only sending a few hundred, maybe battalions-sized elements, so 7, 8, 900 guerrillas into Rhodesia at any given time. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about the tactics.
Yes. Do you think you can go over the equipment of these guerrillas?
Yeah. I was actually going to jump into. Yeah. No. Let's do that. So yeah. So your guerrillas are, as you'd imagine, primarily when it comes to small arms, using AK-47s, AKMs, SKSs, but also anything that they can buy on the international weapons market. So anything that shoots, you can expect them to have, but especially the guerrillas operating out of Zambia. So ZAPU and their militant wing Zebra, they were lavishly supplied by the Soviet Union. So you expect to find a lot of AKs, but also things like Papashas, so PPSHKs. The Tokarev pistol was a symbol of authority amongst the guerrillas and a popular war trophy for the Rhodesian security forces. In any given guerrilla force, you're going to have a squad, so somewhere around 10 guys, and you're going to have one light machine gun and generally one mortar system. The light machine guns are going to be RPDs or PKMs. Again, communist Eastern Bloc weapon systems supplied by the Russians and the Chinese. And then, Chinese and Russian hand grenades, 60 millimeter and 82 millimeter mortars. You're not really going to see anything bigger than that inside of Rhodesia, but in Zambia and Mozambique at the guerrilla training bases, you're going to see things like 75 millimeter recoilless rifles, Soviet T-34, T-55 tanks. So for Lemo and Mozambique, after the war was won against the Portuguese, they did have like a brigade of tanks set up for conventional combat. ZEPRA in Zambia was actually training an entire conventional brigade. So again, because they were backed by the USSR, their philosophy was leaning more towards the conventional side of things, which is part of what prompted the split between ZAPU and ZANU in the first place. But by the end of the war, they had an entire brigade that was set up for conventional combat, including T-34 tanks. Also, in any given guerrilla section, so these are the guys that are infiltrating into Rhodesia, you can expect an RPG, either an RPG-2, RPG-7, something that's popular around that time, being supplied by Eastern Bloc. And if they don't have an RPG, they're going to have a mortar. This is situation dependent, mission dependent. Landmines, extremely popular piece of equipment. And we can talk more about this when we get into strategy, but so these guys will be humping tons of landmines out. You're not really going to see IEDs as much. You will to a certain extent, but primarily they're going to be actual manufactured proper landmines being supplied by their backers. You're not going to see really anything in the way of vehicles inside of Rhodesia. Again, in Zambia and Mozambique, you have conventional forces there, but not within Rhodesia proper. Inside of, again, Angola, Mozambique, Zambia, you're going to see things like radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, MiG-21s, British supplied Rapier missiles and Bofors guns in Zambia, actually, because and we could talk more about the politics of the war, but the British did not support the Rhodesian government, and they did. Zambia was given independence by the British, so they were supplied by the British to a certain extent. I don't really have good figures or timeline on how much and when, but they did have possession of those. And as the war progressed, the air defense posture of Zambia and Mozambique increased more and more, like exponentially, in order to counter the Rhodesian raids across the border against the guerrilla bases that were stationed there. So I think that kind of gives people a good idea of the equipment. Well, I guess it's in terms of what they're wearing, you could expect to see guerrillas having web gear, but probably not a whole lot. They're certainly not wearing helmets. As Mao said, the gorilla swims like a fish in the sea of the people. And the guerrillas fighting in Rhodesia certainly did that. So their intention was to hide as best they could. So you're not going to see guys wearing uniforms a lot in Rhodesia. And if they are, it's something that they can take off, like a jacket. So you might see them wearing jeans and boots. And you could still identify them if you knew what to look for. Certainly the locals knew who they were when they came around, and they could identify them. But they could very easily ditch their rifles, hide their rifles and their jackets in a patrol base, and slip into a village to connect with the locals and scavenge supplies or press gang supplies, I guess, if you want to steal supplies from the locals, because they did that. So that's kind of their equipment overview. Next thing I have to talk about is strategy, but I want to bounce back to you, and I want to hear about the Rhodesian military strategy for the war before I talk about the guerrillas.
So the main Rhodesian strategy of war and of combat is fire force, and essentially what fire force is that it's going to involve basically what I'm going to call reaction troops. Combat troops might be a better word.
Like quick reaction force, almost, right?
More or less like troops that are being deployed to combat. And then there's a reserve in case something was to go down. I was trying to think of how to word that better. Basically, the majority of the air assets of the Rhodesian security forces will be going to Fire Force. And pretty much the idea, as of all things in this, it got kind of inspired a little bit by fighting experience in Malaysia. But pretty much the idea is that you get information that there's insurgents in an area. And the Rhodesian military's goal of this war is to kill insurgents. It's not exactly to win the hearts and minds of people. It is to eliminate the terrorist cells in the country. So
So hold on. Sorry. So the Rhodesians didn't have a, and I'm asking, did the Rhodesians have a clear conception of a long-term strategy other than that, or was it basically just,
the stuff
kill
I'm
insurgents?
the stuff I'm getting is that the way they viewed it is that they were already a legitimate country, and that it was pretty much we have this, these thugs, these dangerous, people of society that we have to fight. So like their goal was basically arrest, detain, eliminate terrorists. That was that was the goal. Was to just stop that completely.
So because
Um,
I've seen, sorry, not to tangent, but I think this is an important point. Like, I've seen a lot of stuff that kind of indicated that to me, as though the Rhodesian government, especially on the political side of things, kind of had their head in the sand about the actual situation, which is almost kind of similar to how it was in Vietnam, right? Like Americans in Vietnam only cared about body count, body count, body count. But they had little in the way of a cohesive strategy for fighting a guerrilla war beyond that.
yes, that's pretty much all the things I've looked into pretty much seem to kind of indicate that. I mean, I know that there was something went in research. I saw that they were talking about they planned to do something after the war that was kind of like I think maybe more progressive, but ultimately their goal during the fighting was just to end the fighting by eliminating the enemy. And Fire Force is the perfect way to do that. Basically, what you're going to do in Fire Force is you're going to take air assets, so you can have bombers to strike the target area. But to get that target area set up, what you're going to do is you're going to have helicopters, mostly in the form of Alouettes, twos and Mark twos and threes. They're going to basically form a circle or a box, maybe more like a circle around an enemy position. And I'll caveat with this: not all the time when they would set up a fire force did they actually have enemies in that area. A lot of times they would just go off a report of, we believe there are insurgents in an area. So they would send out the choppers. They would circle this area. And basically what the choppers do is they're there to basically cut off any kind of escape. Not in the sense of that they're trying to hold them in this certain boxed area, but it's a boxed area in the helicopter's view. So you got to view it like from the helicopter crew's perspective of the box is everything they kind of see. And in between them and the other helicopters is like the box or the circle they're trying to entrap enemies in. And so what they do is that when they box them in, they have quick asset bombers, Canberra bombers that can strike. They have jets, things like that can bomb an area. Sometimes they're going to do that, sometimes they're not. But the main
So
idea
you're
is that you have it cut off, and then you're going to drop your you're going to have paratroopers that can jump from plane. You're going to have helicopter troops that are going to come in. Mostly RLI troops are going to be dropped from these the Alouettes. They're going to, let me see, keep going. I think there's a picture I have of a Fire Force unit. Um, go to the front. Let's see if I have them.
I think
No, go to the
that's
guy with the grenade launcher on his foul. That guy, yeah.
oh, okay.
So this right here is probably a picture of so there is a ground element in the Fire Force that is basically a land vehicle transport element. So the idea is that you can either paradrop, like SAS or whatever. They even paradropped RLI. You're going to have paratroopers jump in right on the enemy, and then you're going to have helicopter troops, which this is going to be the vast majority of these men, fly in and basically run right into combat. Then you have a ground force that is going to basically be more like the reinforcements. They're going to come in on, armored cars, transports, things like that. And then you have reserve units that are on standby in bases in case the situation is crazy.
So, so let me ask you some questions. So the purpose of the, or I guess the idea of the parachute troops and the helicopter-borne troops is to kind of like set up a cordon around either known or suspected guerrilla locations. Is that right? So they would set up this box, you're saying?
It's kind of more like the box is the heli. So I probably should have prefaced this. When the fire force begins, they have separate air units that are basically like gunship helicopters and reconnaissance helicopters. Then the troops there's also other helicopters that are basically landing troops. So those landing troops are going to be mostly sent into just direct combat. They're the gunships and reconnaissance copters have spotted the enemy, or they're continually following them, and they're going to send in the other helicopters are going to send in basically a landing force, and you also have possible paratroopers dropping in. So the idea is that they want to make contact with the enemy as quick as possible.
Okay, yeah.
So then, if they make contact with the enemy, regardless if it's going well or not, the troops in the armored cars are going to come in. They're going to do their job, and ideally, they quickly eliminate the force. Like an operation could take a few hours. A lot of times, they would actually have multiple operations in a day, so you might get multiple calls for this. You might not even kill anybody. It might be they surrender, you arrest them. Oh, it's just some guys out in the bush digging around. Oh, there's not even anybody here. False flag. I think one source I looked into said that it was actually quite common to get lots of false flag fire force operations.
Mm.
But the idea was kind of, taking a sledgehammer to a gnat.
Very interesting. Okay, so I know reading Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth and his operations in Vietnam, a big thing that he criticized the military's, the United States Army's tactical doctrine on was wanting to have some kind of major set piece engagement with guerrillas, which would in turn give the guerrillas an opportunity to run away. And one of the things that he kind of, I don't know if you'd say pioneered, because this is happening at the same time as Rhodesia, but one of the things that he really pushed for was basically kind of setting almost like a net, so completely encircling a guerrilla unit, whether they were a squad or even something larger, and preventing them from escaping. And in that way, he was devastatingly effective in the bush. And my understanding is that the Rhodesian Fire Force fought in a very similar way, because like I was saying before, the guerrilla has to be able to run away. The guerrilla is not there to have set piece engagements and win in a firefight. They're there to, harass, attack infrastructure, conduct ambushes, and then retrograde. And if they're prevented from doing so, especially by the use of a quick reaction force who quickly surrounds them by strategically deploying, a line of paratroopers on one side, connecting them with a line of helicopter-borne troops on the other side, then you have, your truck reserves coming up and forming another side and enclosing them, and then using the helicopter gunships and the Canberra bombers to bomb the inside of that large net. You can be more effective against small guerrilla groups who are trying to escape.
Yes, that's essentially what the Fire Force doctrine is. It's encircle an enemy unit and eliminate it.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I think that's I guess if anybody out there is ever in charge of a conventional force trying to fight a guerrilla force, that's something I think a lot of people need to learn. I think that's certainly a lesson that the United States military learned in Vietnam. And one of the reasons why I think the Rhodesian infantry or the Rhodesian military was so famous for being effective in counterinsurgency operations was the use of this tactic, and completely eliminating from their minds the idea that they were going to have major, big set piece, World War II style battles against the guerrillas, and instead looking to catch them and outdo them at their own game.
Yes, and and to further I need to further break down the Fire Force doctrine, because it really does rely on the small details. So in a Fire Force unit, you're going to have about, I'll use a model I have if I'm getting it right. So you're going to have about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to have about 5 squads for 4 different groups, if that makes kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then these squads are called sticks. In a stick, you're going to have 4 men. Now, each man plays a role, and this is the one thing that I kind of feel like if a man went down, it could be a little dangerous. So each stick's got a stick leader. The stick leader has a radio, and their job is basically they're the commander, but they're also, the communications with the other groups. Then you're going to have a squad automatic weapon in the form of a FN mag. I don't have any pictures of the FN mag. It was in one of I think it was in the SAS picture.
It's M240 Bravo or
yes.
M240 for the American parlance.
Yes, that's basically what it is, what it looks like. Then
medium machine gun.
Yes. Then you're going to have a rifleman that has grenade launcher capabilities. This guy in the picture, that's the role he's fulfilling, and that's probably his stick leader. He's on the using their radio. Then you're going to have a rifleman who is a medic, but I don't want to say a medic in the sense of he is meant to we got he's not supposed to be like a full-time medic. His job is basically to be I guess if someone got shot quick in the field, medic stuff that basically all basic troops would know. But it's the idea is basically you have a leader and a communicator. You have automatic fire with a lot of rounds. Then you have a rifleman with grenade capabilities, and then you have a rifleman that can do in the field medical fixes.
Yeah.
And the idea of that is not to solve the issue of a wounded soldier. The idea of that is to probably stop somebody from dying, or to get them back in the fight. And that reserve unit that's on hold, or the the troops coming in on vehicles, those will have like proper medical groups with them.
Yeah, and I think on that medical part, listening to that YouTube channel 5 Romeo Romeo, it sounds like to me that rifleman is, like you were saying, not a actual medic, but he's the guy carrying all the medical equipment. So
yes.
in U.S. Army parlance, we would call this like the combat lifesaver bag, and that's a bag filled with immediate trauma care medical equipment that is issued to a rifleman. And the only thing he's really doing is carrying it. Maybe we expect him to have a higher level of medical proficiency, but for the most part, we just know, hey, that's the guy carrying the aid bag. So if somebody gets shot, that's the guy you need to go to get that equipment. And that's, and you kind of see this is really important when you're dealing with light infantry. The combat load has to be distributed across all of the members in the team. So you have one guy with the medium machine gun, which is heavy as shit. And then you have one guy carrying the medical bag, which is probably still heavy as shit. You have one guy carrying all those extra grenades, and you have one guy carrying the radio, which again, heavy as shit. So, you can't have everybody carrying the medical equipment and the machine gun. This isn't Call of Duty. You have to distribute that equipment, to different people.
Yes. So. And, to get the idea too, when these helicopters are dropping off these troops, with the Alouette, which what they're going to, Alouettes, which they're going to be using majority of the war, we'll see some, Hueys come in like 78, 79 that we'll see combat and we'll see use in Fire Force. A lot of times as gunships. These copters will be dropping off sticks. So this is, the Alouette's kind of a smaller helicopter. And to begin with, the Alouette's not really the most, I'll just say it this way. I'd rather be riding in a Huey than an Alouette going into combat. I mean, if you've seen do we have a picture of an Alouette? Yeah, go.
I think this first one might be an Alouette. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
If you can see the glass on the front, that's asking to get shot up. That's asking to get lit up. And we can see it's a small helicopter on the inside anyway.
So, and actually on that point, you keep saying stick. And I think I was reading in this book here, the reason why they were in 4-man sticks as opposed to traditional squads was specifically because of the helicopter. So you might have, a company of the Rhodesian Light Infantry who was on Fire Force duty for a week. And so for during that time, they would reorganize themselves into sticks specifically to fit into the helicopter. So that's not something that would, if you were deployed in the field in a regular, a regular formation, whether dismounted or using vehicles to get from one place to another, the stick is not, the stick is unique to the Fire Force and the helicopter-borne troops. It is a consequence of the seating capacity of the helicopter, not a tactical decision. If that makes
Yes.
sense.
And a lot of times too, because of the the situation, it's quick response, um, you know, whatever. These guys, I know I said that other units were doing this, but the RLI was really carrying out a lot of these operations, and they're literally putting the lot in light infantry. I mean, as I said earlier, um, you might have a guy wear a shirt, uh, not even like the military shirts with the bush stroke camo. It might be a green or tan shirt, black shorts, whatever shoes, whether it's civilian, safari boots, regular boots, whatever. U.S. jungle boots. There were some of those that got used. Um, is basically just a guy with whatever he's wearing and a gun going in with his equipment to do the job. So it's very,
Right.
very, everything about it is more or less get into combat. It's encircle, get into combat as quick as possible, eliminate the force. If they run away, which did happen sometimes, some troops did get, some enemy contacts did get away. Those ground and reserve troops would actually have trackers, like soldiers designated as trackers in them to track.
Yeah, so that's actually a really cool point. In listening to some of Five Romeo Romeo's videos, he does talk about that. And for perspective, right? Like, let's say that a section, so a squad-sized element of guerrillas, is found somewhere out in the bush. When the fire force deploys to surround this element, we're not talking about, like, a couple of soccer fields in size. I mean, you're talking about an area, a battlefield, if you will, that is kilometers by kilometers, right?
Yes.
So these sticks are being deployed, not inside of each other, and then they're going to do what in United States Army parlance we would call a movement to contact. So these sticks have the value of having a radio with each stick is that they can communicate to each other and then also communicate to the command and control aircraft that's circling above. So as they're moving through the bush trying to make contact with these guys, they can know where everybody else is to their left and to the right. So it is 100% possible, that guerrillas could slip through this net as they're drawing it in on the suspected enemy location. And then, yeah, in Five Romeo Romeo's videos, he's discussed having, I think, American trackers, but also native African trackers as well, to then, go out and, maybe the Fire Force mission fails and they pull back some of the troops, but we leave some to keep pursuing these tracks and try and find these guerrilla groups to, again, initiate contact, maintain contact, fix them, and finish them, maybe again with another Fire Force mission like the next day or the day after.
Or that night.
Or that night. You're right. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing too that I find amazing about the Fire Force is that going into combat has got to be pretty intimidating and pretty serious to begin with. But the fact that you could be going up against 30 insurgents, armed well, and your little 4-man stick is the first group to make contact with them. Nobody else makes contact with them for another hour.
Right.
So it kind of speaks to the the bravery, but then when we see those casualty statistics, it really makes me amazed that we have 4 Rhodesians. This is hypothetical here. 4 Rhodesians in the stick. Each man is in a unique spot versus insurgents where they could have 10 riflemen, probably more than that. Maybe even a sniper. Uh, you know, multiple machine guns, um, radios, whatever, mortars. I mean, it's just amazing. And another thing too, I wasn't able to find that I would want to really dig into with the Fire Force tactic is I was talking earlier about how the Rhodesians were smuggling in weapons like G3s. There were actually some M16 AR-15s that found their way over, mostly end of the war, that came by American vets. But I've wondered how that would play into Fire Force. I mean, obviously for the medic, it doesn't matter. But I mean, I'm not aware of G3s. I mean, I'm pretty sure G3s can have grenade launcher capabilities. I know AR platform rifles can, but I mean,
So I can actually speak to that a little bit.
okay,
Not specifically the AR-15s, but so um, when we're talking about the grenade launcher rifles, as we saw in that one picture, and let me try and find it again. Yeah, so that's a rifle grenade, right? So that is a grenade that is put on the end of a rifle barrel, and then a blank is fired out of the gun to propel that rifle grenade, where towards its intended target. The Rhodesians were using FALs that they had in store from the beginning of the war, but as the war progressed, they were using what's called the R1, which I believe was primarily manufactured in South Africa and imported
yes,
to Rhodesia from there. And the R1s could not actually accept rifle grenades. So I think a lot of the footage, and if you were to talk to Rhodesian war veterans, you're not going to see as much use of um, uh, rifle grenades as we might expect if we were to just read a book or something like that, because the R1 was the most common version of the FAL, and it was it was far more basic, and rifle grenades in general have fallen out of favor, especially because the United States military was using the M79 in Vietnam. So using actual dedicated grenade launchers as opposed to rifle grenades, they're a little bit of a hassle, because if you accidentally shoot a live cartridge out of a rifle when you're supposed to be shooting a blank because you're trying to shoot a rifle grenade in the heat of combat, that could go very poorly. So rifle grenades have kind of fallen out of favor. I'm not sure the extent to which they were used or weren't used in Rhodesia. Obviously, we have a picture here, so we know they were used somewhat, but I do know that specifically the R1s could not accept rifle grenades. And but I think otherwise, tactically speaking, if you had soldiers armed with M16s that had been stolen from Vietnam or something like that, it's really not going to affect the tactic that much, because, and I'm a bit of a polemicist for the Rhodesian light infantry and the fire force, being a former light infantryman, because I think the light infantry is the pinnacle of being in the infantry, and the movement to contact techniques, the fire force techniques that they were using, is really the creme de la creme of what it means to be a light infantryman. So moving to contact, making contact with the enemy with just direct fire weapons, just shooting at them, right, just with your rifle and with your MAG. That is the foundation of the fire force tactic, because after that, it's only a question of either winning the gunfight or getting more reinforcements, and like we were talking about, that box and closing that net around them so that they can't escape. So even if you lose contact with them, as the guerrillas are breaking contact from you, they're going to run into another element of the fire force as they've been parachuted in on another axis on the other side of the battlefield, or they're going to be hit from the gunships as they are coming over the battlefield watching for runners. So
yes.
that would be my 2 cents on that.
The main last thing I wanted to touch on for what I've got today was some of the vehicles. And I'll discuss the Alouettes and Canberra bombers, but I wanted to talk about the Rhodesian armored capabilities, which I was surprised when digging, trying to research this, looking up, well, what was the main Rhodesian battle, what was their main battle tank? Now, in the Second World War, especially in Italy, Rhodesian, um, the Rhodesian armored division. I can't recall this particular division, but at the time, they ironically had the name of Cella Scouts. It was not
Huh.
what you think. They ended up becoming the nickname of the Black Devils because they apparently wore black over coveralls, um, but and leather jackets. But the Rhodesians didn't have a main battle tank. I would have thought they would have had some Shermans at least, or some British tanks, but
So
they didn't.
I know in this book here they said that at one point during the war, and I don't have a good date on it, they were supplied with 8 captured T-34s, I
Yes,
believe,
I
from the
was.
South
It was
Africans.
T-55s, and
T-55s. There you go.
the way I was gonna talk, I was wanting to save that like as like a
Oh, I
suspense
beat you to
factor
it. Sorry.
because it's kind of an interesting story about those. So those 8 T-55s, from what I've gathered, were the only legitimate main battle tanks of the Rhodesian military, and they never saw action. But what happened with them was kind of fascinating. So these T-55s were from Poland originally, all 8 of them. And they were supposed to go to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. But
Really?
something happened with them, and I don't remember the exact details, but they ended up in South Africa. The South African government got a hold of them and said, "Hey, we'll just send these puppies to Rhodesia." So the Rhodesians get a hold of them and they immediately start training with them. They train for conventional warfare with them because you got to think about this too. And I think we've maybe kind of specified this, but the way this war is going is, I think most wars kind of, they start, they heat up, they reach a climax, and they kind of go down. But this war is, if you can picture someone hitting the pedal in the car and just holding it down. This war is just getting more crazy, more chaotic, more casualties. Um, and if the war had went on in the 80s, we probably would have seen actual, like conventional warfare. And basically, this whole time, the Rhodesians are paranoid that a conventional war against, the terrorists is going to break out. Um, so they're training with their tanks. They also have some staghounds from World War II. So they have armored car capabilities. That's the only thing that they have that can fight tanks. But when they get reports that there are T-70s, I think it's T-72, the specific model. There's, I think, also T-55s over in Mozambique. Basically, the gist is when they get reports that there's main battle tanks in their neighboring countries that are hostile to them, they get paranoid. They start getting anti-tank rounds. They start training their armored cars for conventional warfare. I mean, they've been doing that to begin with, but they double down. They start equipping troops with bazookas and recoilless rifles. They basically start preparing for, the fact that they don't have really main battle tanks, but they're going way out of their way to make sure that there's some capability to fight against tanks that's effective, whether that be infantrymen with handheld weapons or that's armored cars ganging up on, enemy tanks.
So they were aware of this threat then, because I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the guerrilla strategy, because the guerrillas were thinking the same exact thing, and the war never came to that. But so I don't want to jump ahead, but yeah, very interesting.
They're aware of the strategy. They're paranoid about it, and I think it just shows, that the Rhodesian security forces were really impressive, that they were fighting with literally, like, some challenge would be thrown their way and they would come up with something clever to use against it.
Awesome. All right, I just put in a fresh Zin pouch, and if you're done, I think we're ready to talk about the guerrilla strategy. But I don't want to. I don't want to. You got more? I don't want to cut you off short.
I think I'm pretty much done with everything for my end tonight, for this stream.
Well, let's take a quick pause and bathroom break then, and then
That
we will
sounds
talk
good.
about guerrilla strategy.
Yeah.
All right. So, okay, I have a lot on guerrilla strategy, and I'm going to go for it, but I want you to butt in whenever you're ready, because I think a lot of this would provide good opportunities to kind of ping pong back onto the Rhodesian security forces side of things. So if you got something to say, just jump in and say it. All right.
Alrighty.
All right. So in the early 1960s, the guerrillas didn't really have a cohesive military strategy. As I talked about in the beginning, the guerrillas in the West, operating out of Zambia, this is ZAPU and ZIPRA, their militant wing, were really pushing for a conventional style of war. So Maoist military doctrine has 3 phases traditionally. You have strategic defensive, which we would call guerrilla war, strategic stalemate, and strategic offensive, sometimes called mobile warfare. So in Vietnam, you saw a lot more mobile warfare, like with the NVA. The war in Rhodesia never really progressed to mobile warfare. It really stayed more at the strategic defensive and the strategic stalemate. But in the beginning, in the 1960s, late 1960s, Zapu and Zipra were getting really aggressive with their conventional tactics. So as we mentioned in the first episode, the Battle of Sonoa, which was not really a battle, it was just like a massacre of a guerrilla section that had infiltrated into Rhodesia. That was kind of a very descriptive of how the beginning of the war went for the guerrillas. They were really going hard in the paint and getting completely mobbed. They were not doing so well, which again is what prompted the split of Zapu and Zanu. So then you have Zapu in the west and Zanu in the east. Within each faction, there's a lot of clan politics, personality conflicts, and this disrupted the guerrilla side of the war. There was no cohesive unitary government like there was in the Rhodesian security forces side. So this is a constant problem that happened over and over again throughout the course of the war. You have different leaders vying for power, unconfirmed assassinations of guerrilla leaders in the late war by other guerrilla leaders, things like that. So, in the beginning, you have this mobile style of warfare. They're getting absolutely, mopped up by the security forces. Zipra and the Soviets believed that a conventional fight was going to be very important and built up equipment for that end from the very beginning. As you were mentioning, the security forces kind of got wind of this. Very interesting anecdote. Zipra and with the Soviet backing, came up with a plan called Operation 0 Hour. It was a super secret, top secret, secret squirrel plan that reflected their belief that that the conflict as a whole hinged on an eventual conventional offensive. So this plan, Operation 0 Hour, was a multi-front offensive. They were going to capture bridgeheads from Zambia in the west and Botswana into Rhodesia. They were going to attack airfields and secure them, and from there they were going to bring in Soviet MiG fighter jets from Angola into Rhodesia, combined with the guerrilla forces sabotaging infrastructure and conducting ambushes in the interior of Rhodesia. This was their super secret plan for a conventional war. This never happened. The Soviets actually didn't even back it. The Soviets refused to release pilots that they had been training, like Zipra pilots. They refused to release them back to Zipra because they thought it was such a harebrained idea. But cool note, because you were talking about this, the guerrillas were 100% expecting this to go into a conventional force. So in Zipra especially, not Zanla in the east, but Zipra, they had an entire brigade by the end of the war that was set up for conventional warfare. So they had tanks, they had armored vehicles. I mean, full on Cold War conventional combined arms brigade. They were ready for that to happen. Of course, it never really materialized. The primary strategy after the strategy had been repaired from their earlier losses was guerrilla warfare. So phase one Maoist style doctrine. This hinged especially on attacking critical infrastructure. So, let's see here. I have a list of things that they did. Yeah, here we go. Farm attacks, digging up roads, destroying cattle dips, attacking protected villages and security bases, mortaring villages, farms, security bases. They were robbing stores, laying mines, conducting punitive murders and massacres, attacking and burning and robbing commercial buses and other commercial vehicles, shooting down civilian airliners, sabotaging railways and telegram lines, blowing up bridges, raising tobacco fields and tobacco barns, which is a major cash crop in Rhodesia. So this is to give you an idea. This is kind of the general strategy of communist guerrillas, not only in Rhodesia but also like in many other places. It's basically just complete anarchy. And in doing so, they were hoping to force, especially in the early days, they were hoping to force the Rhodesian government to the table, which ended up working in 1979 when the war ended. But in the beginning of the war, they thought that if they did this enough, the British were going to intervene and the Rhodesians would come to the table. They were not expecting the Rhodesians to put up as staunch of a defense as they did. So a major piece of guerrilla strategy, to the extent that guerrillas operating within Rhodesia would spend something like 80% of their time doing this, was propaganda. So to get into kind of a little bit of military theory, I guess, you know, um, Karl von Clausewitz said that war is the extension of politics by other means. So from that, you can kind of say that conventional militaries seek victories on the battlefield in order to accomplish political objectives. All right. Guerrillas, not only in Rhodesia, but everywhere, basically do the opposite. And what I mean by that is guerrillas who have no hope of winning a conventional conflict hope to kind of starve and demoralize their opponents, usually the legitimate government of wherever they're conducting a revolution, whether it's in Cuba or elsewhere, to the point where they capitulate. So a major part of that is using propaganda to get that political victory that they could not achieve on the battlefield. So it's not quite an opposite, but it's a way that I like to describe guerrilla warfare to people, to get them to understand that guerrillas are not interested in winning on the battlefield. Right? In Afghanistan, the Taliban never defeated the United States military, but eventually the United States military packed up and went home. So they did not achieve a military victory on the battlefield ever, but they still won the war. Why? Because they won politically by forcing their opponents to adopt a different strategy or just give up and go home altogether. And same thing in Vietnam. You see this in basically every guerrilla conflict that's ever happened. In Cuba, it's the same thing. So Zanla in the East, like I mentioned, under the political party of Zanu, they were backed by the Chinese, and so they had a much better grasp of this kind of strategy from the beginning, because the Chinese were already pushing them to adopt a peasantry, rural-focused approach. In Cuba, you saw the same thing with Castro, where the fighting and the guerrilla operations primarily take place away from urban centers in the rural areas, because what they're doing is they're forcing the Rhodesian government, or in Cuba, the Cuban regime, to expend more and more resources, stretch their supply lines further and further, split up their troops more and more to guard 1 million positions, 1,000 farms, all these different little villages, to the point where they are exhausted, and they are consuming more and more resources for less and less actual gain on the security front. So propaganda, that's what I was talking about. Propaganda. They were using, not necessarily using, but you could kind of consider them situationally allied with Western media. So Western democracies, funnily enough, for all of their fighting against the communists during the Cold War, supported, maybe not explicitly, but tacitly, the communists in Rhodesia. In Britain, it was often said that, the British people, their hearts were with the Rhodesians fighting there, but a lot of them couldn't understand why they were fighting at all, because they were fighting against popular government, right? Democracy, mass democracy. This is the most important thing, right? This is the pinnacle of neoliberalism. Everybody has to have a vote. It has to be decided by majority, and if it's anything other than that, well, it's evil. And so you have a lot of Western newspapers who are reflecting the guerrillas in a fairly positive light, despite the fact that they are committing tons of heinous massacres. And I have some anecdotes on that I have to read later.
The vast majority of the populations in the West who don't even really support the guerrillas, it's the governments.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Yes. And again, like I said, their hearts and minds are with the Rhodesians, but the governments are actively embargoing the Rhodesians, to the point where at the end of the war, you'll hear Rhodesian veterans say, "We ran out of gasoline, we ran out of bullets, we didn't run out of the will to fight." And I've heard Rhodesian veterans say that on podcasts, and it's 100% true, because they were defeated on the political front. They were defeated on the propaganda front. So guerrillas operating inside Rhodesia would spend the majority of their time going into villages and establishing networks of sympathizers. The African word pongwe, I guess is how it's pronounced, Pungwe. It's a word that means dawn, literally, I think, in the Shona language, but it was effectively like a nighttime rally by guerrillas in the local village. It might begin with speeches, and then you would sing songs and drink beer. And depending on the situation, there might be punitive killings. So if the guerrillas thought that there were people supporting the Rhodesian government in that village, those pongways at night would be an opportunity for them to exact punitive discipline against that village. And I know I keep referencing this book on the Rhodesian War, but the Rhodesian War Military History, Stackpole Military History series by Paul Moorcraft and Peter McLaughlin. But I do have to say this book kind of whitewashes the atrocities committed by the guerrillas, and it almost seems kind of a aftershock of the same thing that was happening in Western newspapers at the time, because a lot of Western newspapers would latch on to the propaganda being put out by the guerrillas, not from the guerrillas in the field, but the guerrillas at their home bases. So every time that the Rhodesian government would have a mass hanging of actual terrorists and actual criminals, or they would actually, execute terrorists, these things were publicized and propagandized and sent over the radio waves. But the daily murders and mutilations and torture that was being done by the guerrillas was kind of not talked about. So that is a significant reason why the Rhodesians lost support from, or I guess they never really had support, but why support for the Rhodesian government continually waned throughout the war, and they were really this pariah state on the national stage. Alongside of that, there is an important word, mujiba, Mujiba. A mujiba is usually a teenager, so boys as young as 5 years old could be a mujiba. And these were kind of like the lookouts, intelligence gatherers, messengers for the guerrillas. These were typically young boys who were caught up in the glory and the excitement of these guerrillas who would come to their village. Imagine you're 12 years old, you're 14 years old, and a bunch of guys. You're in some village, some far-flung rural village, living in a mud hut in Rhodesia, and a bunch of guerrillas come there and they tell you all of this about the glory of Black nationalism, and they tell you about the history of Rhodesia, and they go back and they did this a lot. They would refer to the first Chimaranga, which was the revolutionary struggle that the Black nationalists were fighting in the 1890s, like the first Chimaranga. So they referred to the Rhodesian Bush War as the second Chimaranga. So they were really going hard on this propaganda front. The Mujibas, interestingly enough, it's not uncommon that it's not uncommon. It's actually very common in guerrilla conflicts that you will have civilian sympathizers acting in this way as scouts, messengers, kind of logistics infrastructure for guerrillas operating in the field. But the extent to which it was done in Rhodesia was maybe more extensive than it would have been in Vietnam or someplace like that. I've heard anecdotes of Mujibas, 16-year-old boys in villages, basically holding their entire village hostage because they were so in with the guerrillas that if anyone defied something that this boy said in their village, they knew that they were at risk for being bayoneted the next night when the guerrillas came to get supplies, right? So the Mujibas were a very important part of the civilian logistics infrastructure and the propaganda strategy of the guerrillas. Zanla, at the end of the war, claimed that they had some 50,000 Mujibas acting in their territory, which is on the eastern side. And that's in 1979. So that's many times more than they had actual guerrillas operating in the field, right? They had at most a few thousand guerrillas. They had 50,000 Mujibas who were dedicated full-time supporters. There's another anecdote I actually found where in one instance, the Rhodesian Air Force a Rhodesian observation post spotted a column that they thought were guerrillas, like 100, 150 guerrillas moving through a field. It looked like they had weapons. So they called in an airstrike. Canberra bombers, gunships came in, mowed these guys down. When the dismounts went up to conduct a battle damage assessment, they found out that these weren't actually guerrillas. They were Mujibas, and they were carrying fake AKs. They were carrying wooden AK-47s. And, personally, in that particular anecdote, I would say that this was a cynical ploy being used by the guerrillas. I'm sure they told these Mujibas to, hey, go get some wooden AKs, make yourself some lookalike weapons. And I'm sure they were using that to draw out to draw out Rhodesian security forces to goad them into attacking them, and then that could then be used as a propaganda tool. So you see this kind of thing happening over and over again.
On that note, I can't remember where it was, but it was one of these African conflicts. I'm pretty sure I heard of a story about that they sent the whatever terrorist group it was sent people into combat with wooden AK-47s, and I'm not talking about legit AK-47s that are made of wood. I'm talking about like wood cutouts of AK-47s.
I've heard of crazy things like that happening in the Congo, especially because they had kind of like a, I don't want to say voodoo, but like part of their religion. I've heard crazy stories like that where the guys would think they were bulletproof because of like black magic that was being done. So that would not surprise me. I've heard
Yeah,
stories very similar to that.
That's like the who were they? The Boxers and the Boxer Rebellion thought
Yeah.
that they could they literally were like, we are anti-gun because that's like what cowards do, and instead we can literally box you to death. like they literally thought they're like, we will kung fu you to death, and they would just get gunned down by Maxim guns.
Well, it's interesting. On this note, my next bullet point was talking about witches and spirit mediums in Rhodesia. So I think last episode we were kind of talking about how the communist guerrillas were almost using communism and Marxism as a skin suit. Remember how we were talking about that? Communism, for anybody who is not aware, is an atheistic ideology. It was atheistic in China under Mao. It was atheistic in the USSR. The guerrillas in Rhodesia were anything but atheists. The spirit mediums in villages and tribal trust land areas were actually a very important part of the guerrillas' strategy to mobilize the populace. And in many ways, they believed in their primitive religion, to be on kind of like a holy war, right? They would call back to the souls of those that were lost in the 1890s during the original colonization. King Labangula. There was instances of witches and spirit mediums in the 1890s who were executed by colonial forces. So their names and their spirits were being used to propagandize the locals and to motivate the locals. And I make it sound cynical to a certain extent. Obviously, it is a cynical strategic ploy, but also there's plenty of anecdotes of guerrilla leaders high up in the leadership who really believed in this. So it wasn't entirely a cynical ploy. This was a legitimate motivating factor. And again, a major part of their propaganda campaign to gin up the populace. And I should say this, I think a lot of what we've talked about makes it seem like this is some kind of popular war. I have another book here called The War as I Saw It by George Makanisi Matuvi. He was a black Shona boy who lived during the war. He wrote a memoir about his experience. I think he lives in Canada now. He's like an electrical engineer or something like that. But the impression I got from reading his memoir is that, as is the case in many wars, the civilian population couldn't care less, and I mean, certainly the Rhodesian military's population of black soldiers attests to this. This is not the way that, maybe, again, your high school social studies teacher would have pointed it out to you. This is not like civil rights with guns. Okay. This is a civil war, and where the civilians are by and large innocent bystanders. They don't really care about the war. And that's why the guerrillas have to make a concerted effort to propagandize them and to get them to join their cause. It is not a given that the civilian population of black natives is on the side of the guerrillas. So that's an important point, because there are also Rhodesian government sympathizers within the black populations, which is why so many of these punitive killings were done. So that's an important point, I would say. Let's see here. So in terms of the structure, earlier I already talked about how Zebra in the west under Zapu had a conventional side. They had a conventional brigade, and then they also had a guerrilla side of their army. It was kind of split like that. They were always smaller than Zanla, and at the end of the war under Mugabe, obviously they were the the losing faction of the guerrillas. They lost out to Zanla, which was much more powerful and much larger, and their actual strategic structure of the way they structured their guerrilla forces inside Rhodesia was not nearly as thorough as it was with Zanla. With Zanla, they broke up the pieces of Rhodesia into provinces or war zones, as they called them, and then within each war zone, it was divided up into sectors. Now, the sectors were geographically demarcated by things like roads and rivers, but really what the sector, more importantly, designated was a company-sized element of guerrillas. So somewhere between 100 and 200 guerrillas who operated in that area. The geographic boundaries are not so important. The sector more refers to that company. And then the companies were broken down not into platoons like we would have in a conventional war, but into sections from there. So each section, again, 10 to 15 men, about a squad-size element, was its own element that operated largely independently in support of a broader strategic mission within their area of operations. I guess I can just go ahead and jump into the tactics now. That more or less covers the strategic approach throughout the war. And again, strategy versus tactics. Strategy, big picture. Tactics, small scale.
That sounds good. I know that when I was talking about the vehicle stuff earlier, I forgot to mention the Pookie. And because it kind of plays into the insurgent tactics. So you're talking about the landmines, and we have the picture of the Pookie if you want to move it to that screen.
Do we?
It's that weird looking vehicle thing. Yeah, that's
that
it.
thing.
Yeah, it's a Pookie. It's a landmine clearing device. And what happened was that later on in the war, when the insurgents, the mines increased, I forgot how they made that, but they made it by a wacky roadie crazy invention like redneck ingenuity. It's roadie ingenuity, and basically when they started planting they started getting the mine clearing devices with it. The insurgents would actually target those first out of anything. And so they put bulletproof glass on it, but the insurgents would jump them. So there's a thing on the front right there, if you can see it. They called that the spider gun, and it was loaded with shotgun shells. And so the idea
That
was
is
that
crazy.
the idea is that when the insurgents would jump out at them and start firing off their AKs full auto into the thing, they would hit the button on it, and it would burst just like probably like 1,000 shotgun rounds out.
That's
Hell, it's not
crazy.
kill everybody. I wanted to mention that just because how goofy it was, and now they're still used to this day for but they're vehicles of peace. They use them to clear mines in war zones in Africa.
That's so interesting. It's funny you say that because in the one of the books I was reading, I did note that as the war progressed and as the guerrillas used more and more mines, the Rhodesian security forces had a bigger and bigger push to produce their own mine-resistant, ambush-resistant vehicles within Rhodesia. So kind of like how the United States military learned this lesson in Afghanistan, the Rhodesians did the same exact thing. So as the war progressed, they were building bigger and badder mine-resistant vehicles because the roads were just so incessantly mined everywhere.
The Zimbabwean government was going to actually get rid of them. They were going to destroy them, and then like the UN came in and said, "Hey, we actually need these for Eritrea to clear mines."
That's
So
interesting.
they just painted them hot instead.
Yeah. Side note, mines are nasty, man. Because I know in the United States military we abide by the Geneva Convention, so the mines that we use all self-deactivate within a certain time period. But the Russians, other governments, nobody else really does that. So you lay a minefield, it's going to be there forever. So
That's good to know.
Tragically, a lot of civilians and kids will die for years and years after wars and be dismembered by minefields.
I've done some digging. I say digging. I've done some exploring on abandoned military bases and stuff, looking for like Indian mounds, and the bases had mines. We don't know where. And I was always worried that I'm going to look for a ruin, I would step on one.
I don't know if I'd have to be worried about mines in the continental United States, but certainly unexploded ordnance is always something to watch out
Yes,
for.
but
So
continue with the
yeah,
certain
yeah, yeah.
tactics.
No, that does segue into this a lot. So primarily the guerrillas are moving into Rhodesia from Zambia. And let me pull up the map again. They're moving into Rhodesia from Zambia and Mozambique by foot. So these guerrillas are pack muling all of their equipment, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. So they're moving from, patrol base to patrol base. They're moving from friendly village to friendly village. They're hiding out in kraals, Kraal, which is a word for basically a pen for livestock in Rhodesia. They're moving from one to another, hiding, and never staying in one place for more than a day or two, and they're walking by foot from the places where they cross the border into Rhodesia. And the Rhodesian government, in an attempt to fight this, they began building what's called the cordon sanitaire. So it's just a cordon, right? So they would, it's a combination of barbed wire and minefields along the border, especially in the northeast and the eastern border with Mozambique. This is a tactic that the Rhodesian government used to try and frustrate the attempts of guerrillas to infiltrate across the border. But talking about landmines, these guerrillas are sometimes packing out, 100, 150 pounds of gear, their weapon, their equipment, the food that they need, but also landmines. And so, funnily enough, there's plenty of anecdotes where guerrillas would get across the border and quickly bury their landmines because they didn't want to have to carry them further into the interior of Rhodesia. And as you can see on this map, I mean, these arrows here represent the infiltration routes of guerrillas. So, I mean, these guys are literally walking across Rhodesia. So, yeah, you don't want to be carrying mines all the way across Rhodesia, but obviously probably would have been better for them, tactically speaking, if they did, because then they could actually place the mines where they were intended to go. But that did happen a lot, where they would just bury them along the nearest roadside and then carry on keeping on with a lighter pack. Let's see here. So I was talking about the Mujibas and their support structure. So I had kind of referenced this like the Underground Railroad of guerrillas. That's exactly what this was. This is how they moved from the border to where they were actually intended to operate. And like I said, the support for the guerrillas was not a given. And in this book, The War as I Saw It by George Matuvi, he notes that his father was a shop owner in some small village. So he had basically a general store. And the guerrillas came one day to the village. The war had not really touched them yet, but one day as the war was progressing and getting, spreading, the guerrillas came and they did their whole Pungwe thing and they tried to rally up the population. And then they went to his dad and they were like, hey, you're going to give us supplies. And they were telling, not asking, if you understand what I mean. And so this put a lot of the civilians in Rhodesia into this kind of catch-22 because, they're living where they've always lived. This is their ancestral homeland. They're living in the village where their father and their father's father lived. And they have a shop, that's maybe intergenerational, or they're a farmer, or they're a herder, and they have their livestock. This is their means of sustenance, right? Their subsistence agriculture, or they have a small shop. The guerrillas come to you and tell you that you're going to supply them with what they need. Now, guerrilla doctrine, and there is publications that the guerrilla armies would put out saying how they were supposed to treat the civilians, and it looks nice on paper. They're like, you should never be impolite to anybody, always pay for what you need. That didn't happen. Big surprise, right? Specifically in the book, The War as I Saw It, the guerrillas promised George's father that after the war was won, he would receive restitution for all of the material that was taken from his shop. And we're not just talking like, bags of rice. I mean, we're talking Coca-Cola and cigarettes, right? Blue jeans. Okay. So, that restitution never came. And these civilians are caught in this catch-22 because they're supporting the guerrillas, not because they want to, but because they'll be killed if they don't. And then when the Rhodesian security forces come through, they're at risk from being arrested or killed by the Rhodesian security forces for supporting the guerrillas. But if they try to go to the Rhodesian security forces to help them with the guerrillas that are extorting them, well, then the guerrillas will come and kill them, right? So eventually, in George's case, they up and left. They ended up moving to Bulawayo, and his father went into hiding, both from the guerrillas and from the Rhodesian security forces, because, like I said, this catch-22, the guerrillas think he's supporting the security forces think he's supporting the guerrillas, and this is, from what I gather, a very common thing. So, again, the victims of war are oftentimes not the soldiers themselves, but the civilians who are caught in the crossfire. And I think that's really important to note, because it's sad. So tactically, when the guerrillas would go into a village to conduct their pungwe or to gather resources, they're going to be hiding their weapons. So with the United States military, we would call it patrol base. Other militaries might call it a laager, Laager. The guerrillas are basically doing the same thing. So they're hiding out in the bush someplace, setting up a security perimeter, and they're going to ditch their weapons, take off their jackets, anything that would identify them as a guerrilla, and go into town. Now, sometimes if they knew they were in a safe area where they were not at risk of being caught by the security forces, they would go in with their weapons, especially when they're committing punitive raids or punitive murders with bayonets, or just shooting people, beating people to death. They would have their weapons with them, but oftentimes they wouldn't. So again, the guerrilla swims like a fish in the sea of the people. Being able to hide and being able to run away is an important tactic of these guerrillas. Each squad, as I talked about before, within the sector, you have a company size element, and then the company size element is broken down into squads. Each squad is going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 guys. And in an ideal situation for the guerrillas, you're going to have a military commander, a political commissar, a security officer, a medical officer, a logistics officer, and then 3 to 5 cadres. And your cadres are basically your regular soldiers. And then all of them would be equipped with a primary weapon, so an AK or an SKS or some kind of submachine gun or something. And then the squad would also have either a mortar or an RPG system, or they would have a light machine gun or a medium machine gun, so an RPD or an RPK or something along those lines. I've also seen notes of having like MG34s that were World War II surplus, captured from the Germans, somehow made their way on the international arms market to Rhodesia, so that happened too. But the ideal structure of a guerrilla squad would be something along those lines. Now, the political commissar is very, very important, as I've already mentioned. I keep hammering on this point because it's important. Political commissar's role is to educate the populace. So guerrilla training really was divided into 2 phases primarily. So when they're training at their base camps in Zambia, these massive, training grounds with thousands of recruits and guerrillas, their training is divided into 2 phases, not unlike really how Western militaries do it. The first phase is political indoctrination, basic weapons, physical training, and the second phase is where they actually learn about ambushes and tactics. But the political commissars are going to be the most educated out of them. So when they go to the when they're going in the villages and doing these pungways, they are focusing and hammering on a set of points. A lot of this comes from Marxist ideology, but again, like I said, they're kind of wearing Marxist ideology like a skin suit, and Mugabe especially never had any grand sweeping intentions of turning Rhodesia into a communist state. Really what they ended up doing and what they always intended on doing was something more equivalent to like a Western style democracy, social welfare. So again, wearing communism like a skin suit a little bit, and the talking points were regionally focused. So like I said, talking about the 1890s, the first Chimaranga, the spirit mediums, King Labangula, the oppression at the hands of the white government, the political ostracization, political oppression, disenfranchisement from voting, land rights, things like that. So again, trying to reach out to the people and garner their support, because without their support, the guerrillas cannot operate. They are the sea, the guerrillas are the fish. Can't have a fish out of water. So
what was I going to say in regards to that? How much did political commissars play in like a combat?
So I mean, they are still guerrillas, so they're going to be fighting, but kind of in the same way as in the Rhodesian stick would have a guy who's designated to carry the machine gun and a guy who's designated to carry the medical supplies. The political commissar is just designated as the political commissar guy. So when it comes to actually conducting an ambush, he's going to be right there with them. But
How did
he's certainly not in the rear or something like that.
how did are there any like I guess you'd say sort of like reports or things of uh terrorists. I don't even know if I can say that word. I've been saying it the whole night.
I think we can.
Insurgents like saying that they thought the commissars were a waste of time. They needed more, combat like assessment or
No, and
combat people.
at least not that I've found. And I think the reason being is that you have to remember these guerrillas are not. These guerrillas are not. They're not militiamen. These are trained guerrillas. You might call them professional soldiers. I wouldn't go that far because they're as far as a Western standard of what a professional soldier looks like, they're not that. But I mean, to hit some numbers here, in 1972 there was only 300 trained Zanla guerrillas. In 1975 they had 6,000 guerrillas, both in training and in the field. But at any given time, there's only a few hundred of these guys. So interesting note, I would say, just talking about guerrilla wars broadly speaking, it doesn't actually take that many people, like physical people, to destabilize an entire government. And I'm not not advocating anything, standard disclaimer insert here, but in Cuba it was the same situation. You only had a few hundred people, and by their determined efforts and discipline to an extent, they're able to destabilize and overthrow a government. So, that's why they're not. And again, the focus of the guerrillas is not combat. The guerrillas know they're not going to win by killing Rhodesian security forces. Killing the Rhodesian security forces is a way to destabilize, demoralize the Rhodesian government and force them to the political talking table, right? So using politics to achieve military victory as opposed to the inverse that a conventional army would look at it.
All right, I got you.
Yeah. So let's see. My notes are all scattered now. So we already talked about the range of guerrilla activities, the farm attacks, the punitive massacres, but I actually want to. Here's another interesting point. So by the late war, a deliberate policy of killing all black laborers who refused to give up their jobs on white farms was adopted, and there were several large massacres. So I do have a anecdote that I got to pull up here. So this is a New York Times story from July 2nd, 1978, and it says, and it's reporting that 14 black farm laborers and children were shot and burned to death last night by a group of 25 nationalist guerrillas who attacked a white-owned cattle ranch in eastern Rhodesia. The guerrillas were said to have attacked the main farmhouse at Mayo, 135 miles east of Salisbury, which is the capital, now Harare. So this is northeastern Rhodesia. Soon after dusk, they were firing rocket grenades and automatic weapons. The invaders were kept from breaking through the fence surrounding the main house by 3 Rhodesian soldiers who were guarding the property in the absence of the owner. And the guerrilla group, after not being able to get into the farm, was then said to have turned on the labor compound, which was some 700 yards away, where 25 field hands lived with their families in 12 huts. And by the time journalists got there the next day, the huts were in smoldering heaps. There were charred ruins of the huts. And inside, one spokesman said that there were the bodies of 1 woman and 5 children. 2 of these were clearly identifiable, but the rest were burned beyond recognition. Nearby was the body of a 55-year-old man who had worked on the farm for 20 years. Black, native African man, okay? Not a white guy. He had been shot and bayoneted, and the corpse also showed signs of burning. These bodies were discovered that night by members of security forces who arrived to begin tracking missions following the traces of the guerrillas in the morning. And then later in the day, 7 more bodies were discovered. They were all men who had been shot in the back from close range, apparently after they had been lying face down on the ground. Okay.
Dang.
And then here's another anecdote. So there was a Pentecostal mission school in northwest Rhodesia. These were 12 persons, 8 white missionaries and 4 of their children. So these are white Western missionaries. I think they were Irishmen, to be exact. They were battered to death, and another woman was so severely wounded that she died at the hospital the next day.
Yikes.
4 days after the attack on the British, they were British evangelists, 2 German Jesuit missionaries were killed. A day later, a government communique reported that a family of 8 farm laborers had been killed in central Rhodesia. In the evening, another communique said that casualties in the fighting in the last 3 days, in addition to those who died, were a white farmer who was killed in an ambush, 19 terrorists and terrorist collaborators. So here they're just going through and listing 16 black civilians. And here's another story snippet that I found about that massacre at the mission. The guerrillas came over the border from Mozambique and attacked the missionaries with axes and other weapons. The inquest revealed the terrible punishment and mutilation that they suffered. One guerrilla later said that the executions were in retaliation for a Rhodesian army attack on a guerrilla camp 2 years earlier. The Elam missionaries knew nothing about it. Ron Chapman, I don't know who that is, probably dead by now. He went up to this school to identify the bodies and deal with the immediate aftermath. All of the deceased, including 3-week-old baby Pamela Grace, had been brutally beaten, abused, and murdered. Their bodies were almost unrecognizable. Together, there were 3 men, 5 women, and 4 children. All right, so I read that to kind of add some color commentary to what this war looks like. Because when you read through, again, this book that I have on the Rhodesian War, the military history book, it kind of whitewashes a lot of this. All right. These guerrillas are not freedom fighters. Well, I guess they are from one perspective, right? One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. But these punitive killings are a daily occurrence, okay? Daily occurrence in Rhodesia by the guerrillas. And a lot of these people don't even have anything to do with the war. They're just innocent. You know, imagine your neighbor has a problem with you and he reports you to the guerrillas for being a Rhodesian sympathizer. The next day, you're beaten, raped, and murdered, bayoneted, right, in front of your children. Your children are probably murdered too. Okay, so that's a major tactic of the guerrillas, and yeah, I think that's important to note because I think a lot of the commentary that I've already provided kind of inadvertently softens what it is the guerrillas were doing just by kind of describing it in a analytical way, and I wanted to provide that because that's. There's actually another quote I have here from Rhodesian Army Brigadier Derry McIntyre in 1976. He said, "I doubt whether the terrorists are so well organized that they can influence their cadres in the field. I would say that possibly the moon affects the terrorists more than Geneva conventions or Geneva conferences. They go mad at periods which are quite unrelated to world affairs." So, you unleash thousands of young men into the bush with very little oversight. And this is what you get. And, for what it's worth, there were attempts by the guerrilla leadership to discipline their guerrillas. So if it was heard that, a particular guerrilla section was, abusing local villagers or doing something wrong, it wasn't uncommon for the punitive murders to then be turned on them by another guerrilla group sent to dispatch them. So that did happen, but,
If you believe in the that quote about that they had basically certain times where they were basically under the influence of things, you're talking about the witch doctor stuff, and this is for anybody, whether you're Protestant, Catholic, whatever. If it'd be kind of interesting if anybody would investigate into possible demonic influences and some of that.
I mean, I guess we're kind of getting off the beaten path here, but if you ask me, I mean, I've done a fair bit of studying into communism, and I know Pete Quinones has been doing a series reading The Last Crusade about the Spanish Civil War, and I would venture to say yes. If you're an atheist listening to this and maybe you don't believe that, that's fine. But read about the Spanish Civil War and you will see this even more clearly than I have painted for you here talking about Rhodesia, because in the Spanish Civil War, they did the exact same thing. I mean, murdered, I think 3 times as many clergymen, raped nuns, shot priests, hunted them down, 3 times as many as were killed during the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. And this is in Spain in the 1930s. This is the communist anarchist uprising, or, well, not uprising, but, revolutionary Republican government in Spain. So
yes.
I would say yes. I would think so.
I would have to agree. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that. I would have to agree. It's like Muhammad in the cave, sort of.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So, a couple more things. I'm sorting through my notes to kind of clean up any little last bits that I wanted to talk about. Bombings, grenade attacks in urban areas, hotels, and suburbs were also a tactic used by the guerrilla forces. These were not so much, again, significant military, victories that they were winning. I think Zanla at one point blew up a fuel depot in Bulawayo, but these were again primarily designed to demoralize and psychologically harm the white urban population centers. But that was a tactic. But again, the Bush War was primarily focused in the bush. But we should talk about that. Should touch on that. That there was urban combat going on. There were guerrillas infiltrating into urban areas, but they typically had a bad go of it when they did, because once they were found in the urban areas, you had SWAT teams that were available. Again, this is the 1970s. This is not like this is not a very long time ago. So there were SWAT teams, local police forces, and the Rhodesian military, and they were generally quickly surrounded and killed. So guerrillas did not fare too well in the urban environments, but there was some guerrilla operations being done there. Let's see. There was 2 Viscount civilian airliners that were shot down by surface-to-air missiles. These were Rhodesian civilian airliners flying either to or from Rhodesia. They were shot down, by guerrilla forces. Again, civilian airliners. What is the purpose of this? The purpose of this is to demoralize and force the Rhodesians to capitulate. So I hope everyone can grasp from all of this rambling that guerrillas don't win, communists don't win, and they don't win today by military victories. Generally speaking, they win by psychological ones, political ones, by controlling the media landscape, controlling the narrative, controlling propaganda. The Viscount airliners were shot down, but do you think that was a major talking point? Sure, it made it to the newspapers in the West, but what also made it to the newspapers in the West was the Rhodesian government justifiably executing terrorists, right? So the media war, the propaganda war, was really how the Rhodesians lost this, because the Rhodesians really didn't have any counter propaganda strategy, from my understanding. They completely neglected that front. Again, they were body count, body count, body count. They figured if they killed enough terrorists, the terrorists would stop. As a matter of fact, no, that's not what happened.
No, they had a pretty. I know the last episode I went on that whole rant about like people try to equate the Rhodesians with like the Third Reich or the CSA. It's like not. I'm not saying it from those governments' points of view. I'm saying it from the grand mythologized narrative that Rhodesia is not. They were like a pro-white state, but at the same time, it's like the majority of the Africans in Rhodesia are just living, and Rhodesia is not this ideological state. I guess is what I'm trying to say. It is literally a living state. The Confederacy, wasn't ideological either, by any means at all. But um, Rhodesia is not this like grand. It's literally just trying to survive. It's literally trying to survive as the nation of Rhodesia by eliminating Zanla and Zapu terrorists.
Yeah, and I do think last episode I said something along the lines of Rhodesia being a state out of time. Certainly you could say they were white supremacists. They were white nationalists, and I don't use that term in a pejorative sense. I'm just saying that as a matter of fact. But the government that they wanted in Rhodesia was effectively a segregationist government. And again, the civil rights narrative that we live in, that we have been, bathed in since our youth, tells us that this is the worst evil ever. But you go to your average black villager, and the Rhodesian, they couldn't care less about the Rhodesian government, right? As you saw in the aftermath of what happened in the war, which we'll talk about in later episodes, that's just not the case. The Rhodesian government was not some evil evil demonic force. And you see the same thing in South Africa today, right? They ended apartheid in South Africa because South Africa was this pariah state. And what happened? Well, the country fell apart because it just so happens the white settlers were the only ones maintaining the modern state there. And that's not, that's not a dig at the natives or something like that. But white people came to Rhodesia, colonized it, built a modern state, and it was then undermined and destroyed by the black nationalist elements who were backed by the communists and tacitly endorsed by Western democracies. So Zimbabwe will never again rise to the heights of economic prosperity and power that it was at its peak in the early 1960s under the white minority Rhodesian government. And you can take your political priors, your Western liberal priors into that and say, well, it's better that they're a majority rule country. I personally don't care about democracy one way or the other, and I think that the best government is the one that has the best benefit for everybody. And white Rhodesians and black Rhodesians knew how to get along with each other to an extent. And again, I'm not trying to whitewash the actual oppression of the white Rhodesian government, because there certainly was. But we touched on it in the background episode, last episode. It was not what we are told it was. And it also simultaneously was not the white nationalist neo-Nazi state that some people would wish it was. So, yeah.
A lot of people I've noted, as I said in last episode, I mean, I was in public somewhere once and I saw a guy wearing a Rhodesian bushstroke jacket, and he was acting like, oh, how bad and cool it was, whatever. And it's like, well, a lot of people don't know, but the U.S. military, the Marine Corps, actually tested Rhodesian bushstroke when they were, I believe, making the Marpat series, and it actually did really well. It actually, I think they might have rated it as actually like one of the better. It was one of the better camos. I think it was like up there with Cadpat and something else. But the idea is that basically Rhodesian bushstroke is actually like it's not some like uh, how can I word this? Red flag with the black,
Oh yeah.
the broken plus sign. It's not a symbol like that. No, it's literally like a effective military camo. So if you think you're like edgy because you're wearing bushstroke, no, but are you cool? Yes.
For sure, cool. Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I strongly admire the Rhodesian Light Infantry and what they were able to accomplish, and we'll talk about this later in the next episode, because the next episode is really going to talk about the war from start to finish, and major battles and whatnot. But what made the Rhodesian security forces so impressive as a counterinsurgency force is the fact that they were so small. They were literally running out of gasoline and bullets, and yet they were more effective
right.
than I mean,
they did everything tactically right, pretty much.
Yes, absolutely. They had a sound military tactic, and and strategy. But I guess you could say maybe it wasn't so sound because they neglected the propaganda and they neglected to see how guerrilla wars are actually won and lost, which is in hearts and minds and newspapers. But then again, I mean, how many governments have really, outside of the Malaya emergency, how many governments have really found an effective way to win counterinsurgency conflicts? We'll talk about that in the next episode.
That's about it.
Yeah, and we'll say I got a lot to say on that too, but we could save that for the next episode. Yeah.
And I'm not referring to the current war that Russia's involved in. I'm referring to Chechnya or whatever. I know that didn't go exactly well, but I do believe that they won the Second Chechen War or something. But
importantly, they managed to integrate the Chechens into the Russian Federation in a way that was stable long term, and that really is the mark of victory in a guerrilla war from the side of the government forces.
Yeah, but I don't have really anything else, Peter. Do you?
Dude, no, man. There's we clear over 2 hours now, so that's pretty solid, man.
Yes, sir. That's pretty good. I guess we'll move on to the actual nitty gritty details of the fighting, like the war and stuff.
Yeah, man.
All right.
All right,
Well, it's
you
been
want
a
to
pleasure.
do plugs?
Yes. So, um, for plugs, follow me on Twitter. I am at Otto Wolfhelmsen. That is Otto capital O Wolfhelmsen capital W. I'll be posting content on there in relation to this. You can also find me as Otto on Spotify. Um, to get your idea of where we're going to be doing the podcast on Spotify. Of course, obviously follow me on YouTube at Otto Hawker. Um, and then on Substack, which I need to get my Substack going again. I am autohawker.substack.com.
All right, man. You guys can find me on Twitter at Peter_C_Thistle. And you can find me on Substack under the same name. I wrote a Substack called Parry This. Seek and ye shall find. And yeah, that's it for me, man.
Yes. Oh, and one more thing. For my Substack, I always forget to include it. But when you go on my Substack, you'll find Wolfhelm Substack. That is like where I do my writings at. It's free content. I don't plan on making anybody ever pay for it. More content will be coming out here soon as I'm trying to get my new schedule in and mainly get these videos recorded.
Yeah, man. All right.
Oh.
Signing off. This has been Rhodesian Bush War episode number 2.
Good night, everybody.